Good afternoon, Sally. Thank you for being here with us. In a moment, Ms. Fraser-Butlin will ask you the questions, but first, Mary will ask you to take the affirmation. Mary.
Please state your full name.
Sally Janine Davis.
And repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely.
I do solemnly, sincerely.
And truly declare and affirm.
And truly declare and affirm.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Sally,
Yes.
I want to start by asking you some questions about how you came to be infected with hepatitis B.
Right.
You were pregnant and started to bleed at 16 weeks gestation. Is that right?
Yes.
And when you were admitted into hospital, the fetal heartbeat couldn't be found, and so you needed to have an evacuation of your uterus.
Yes, that's true.
And you hemorrhaged and required a transfusion.
Yes.
That was in November 1978.
Yes.
And your statement describes that you were unwell after that. What can you tell us about your health at that point?
At that point, it was clear that I had health issues, but it wasn't clear that there was any real lasting strength in them. There was a sort of pedal to get well again kind of feel. And being young, I think one was more optimistic that you could throw it off.
And in terms of how you felt, you've described in your statement as feeling extremely broken. You weren't sure if you were ill or depressed or what was happening. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
Can you tell us any more of how you were feeling at that point?
I think the most difficult thing was literally finding the energy that I could use to get better, look after children, have miscarriages, and all of the things that were compacted together, so possibly even masked how difficult it really was.
You became pregnant again, and at that point your gynecologist did a blood test. And what did he tell you about those results?
He said there was good news and bad news. And the good news was that I was pregnant because I had had a few pregnancies. It was sad. But the bad news was that I'd taken on a disease which in those days was very serious, but wasn't necessarily serious enough to reach me through a GP.
And that was the hepatitis B?
Yes.
Was he able to tell you anything of what he understood the source of the infection to be?
No, there was nothing given, as far as I know, that included any real information, or even soft information, because people weren't asking the questions. I didn't ask them until later, when I realized things weren't quite right. But I think the dearth of information, the time of life in which it occurred, probably dictated the way it is now.
You were pregnant in 1981 with your daughter, and at 32 weeks of that pregnancy, you were admitted to hospital. When you were admitted, how did the staff treat you?
Well, that's an interesting question because it's connected to how it all works, and I must say it was very very difficult to put it together when I went in, because it looked as if I was taking my daughter to a hospital, to a prison rather than a hospital. It was genuinely quite frightening, but the fear probably fell on me because she was too young to note.
And you've described in your statement that when she was born, all the medical professionals were suited up in gowns?
Yes, which indicated, I think, that they knew there was an issue, but we didn't know there was an issue, so automatically you have less chance of creating a good outcome, or even hassling anyone into trying to work out what's wrong with you.
You also had a son, and after having the children, you then trained as a barrister.
Yes.
And what was your health like at that time?
Well, probably worse than I thought, because and that was obviously, as experts know better than I, is quite a frightening outcome. Yes, it was really quite tough, and I kind of removed all my bedding and anything I could find of, and took them off to the hospital and sat in there for 2 weeks. So we did it together, really.
And after having the children, you trained as a barrister, and what happened after a couple of years of working as a barrister in terms of your health?
Well, there was obviously more reason to look at what was going on, because it didn't change. When something doesn't change, you really have to look and see why. And I suppose this was an extreme case of me worrying. Again, it created huge amounts of worry.
And when you say your health didn't change, is that because you were continuing to feel unwell and fatigued and not really picking up?
It didn't. It just was an issue that you couldn't put right yourself. And there were no obvious outcomes in the environment that could help you to identify or go towards the right, possibly, person.
After 2 years in practice, you decided that the physical demands of being a barrister, carrying files and travelling the country, were too much for you.
It was very hard, and having had a difficult baby route, it was hard to not recognise that actually I was doing damage.
And so you transferred into the civil service?
Yes, which was a really good and happy move.
But during your time at the civil service, you continued to have absences from work.
There were enormous times of exhaustion and semi-illness. I don't really know how you describe it, but it's not got its own slot, but it has got its own sense of being fragile and not quite making the mark, which you think you could do. But that was also quite irritating, actually. You had to accept a different sense of what would be considered successful. And it was obviously the children that won, I'm happy to say.
You speak in your statement of not being able to reach your full potential in your career. What can you tell us of how that felt and what you faced?
That really was a dominant daily feeling, because it had been so hard to actually do 10 exams in 5 days, over 3 hours each. And I really did put heart and soul in it, because I felt lucky that I had the 2 children I did have and so easily could not have had. And I almost felt this was more of a sort of gift, that I wouldn't give this up, because this was a thank you. But it was a problem to me to have to do what seemed like double the work other people had to do to keep it straight and on the road. And I feel that I did more or less manage.
And your ill health has continued.
It's been a saga that just every time you think you might be all right, you're not. And I hadn't even till recently, until all of you wonderful people had settled to your work, I hadn't really looked at what it was doing to me in the long term. And these things really don't come out straight away now. And the fact that I was re-diagnosed and re-diagnosed and diagnosed again and again was also a complicated aspect of how you feel about yourself.
And if we just unpack those diagnoses, in the 2000s you developed skin problems. What can you tell us about those?
Well, only that I had skin problems, both in having Henry and afterwards, and they were random and extreme, which is not an easy situation either. But no one could find a cause. It wasn't as if everyone was solving it and I was running a different body. We were all running the same problem.
And you were diagnosed or misdiagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis.
That was almost as shocking as having it, just being told about it. Because I had arranged my life around the fact that it wasn't going to be easy. I was divorced, I didn't have spare energy, and I needed to do X, Y, and Z to even begin. And then suddenly it was if after the 3 years or more that I'd carefully done the diet and the child and things that we all do, but somehow this seemed a bit more difficult. And then in one night I was told, well, actually, you don't have it. I can see it in the eyes. You have Parkinson's disease, which then I had to quite carefully picket it that I didn't say I didn't like it because I didn't like it. It was actually a worry that they might be right.
So initially the diagnosis was rheumatoid arthritis, and you were given very strong medication
Yes.
for that.
For many years. Fortunately, I don't take easily to drugs, and I'm always refusing them and upsetting everyone. But had I taken genuinely the rheumatoid arthritis drugs, I'd be in trouble by now.
And then in the mid-2010s, you were re-diagnosed and told it was fibromyalgia that you were suffering
Which I didn't
from.
listen to at all. I have no idea whether I've got fibromyalgia.
And
I'm
then,
not treated for it or anything.
And then you were diagnosed with Parkinson's disease.
Yes, and then I had to lift my head a little bit and recognize that there was a problem, but did we really know what it was? After a whole lifetime of misdiagnosis and illness and running, as it were, to catch up, I wasn't quite sure what I should sit down and quietly research, and in the end I haven't done a huge amount by choice.
And that's your current diagnosis, that it's of Parkinson's?
Yes, and it's quite seriously made by serious and good people, but they're comfortable and happy enough to let me occasionally wander off the scale and find another way of not having the illness.
In terms of hepatology, in terms of liver care, what follow-up have you had?
Quite a lot, but not at the beginning. I started to get more and more worried that I hadn't really taken it as seriously as I should. And so my GP, who was a very splendid and helpful person, sent me to somebody who was in those days clearly significant, but I can't tell you who they are without. It was a lady, and I can't remember her name.
And that was in about 2010, I think, that you were referred into
It was
hepatology
about
care.
that, actually, yes, that is probably about right.
And you've then had relatively regular blood tests, liver function tests, and an ultrasound every year.
Yes,
And I think that
but they're quite serious investigations. I don't think they just stand up as being a bit of a nuisance.
And what is the condition of your liver?
Well, you will know more than I, but it's done on a step basis. And I'm carefully monitoring the steps, clearly. And it started to go up. I did all I could, and you know, the no drink and the no food, and sit back and it'll be all right. But I think the worry with that was mostly that I got another one. I'm very suspicious, I'm afraid.
And the liver, what you've been told, I think, from your statement, is that your liver is cirrhotic. There is cirrhosis.
I think the cirrhosis bit is a little bit over-diagnosed, and it's had 2 diagnoses, one of each. So it's obviously not a happy liver, but it's not totally, lost as a cause yet.
And in terms of the interaction between your liver and the hepatitis B and your Parkinson's disease, what are the difficulties you've had, particularly with medication, in that regard?
Medication's been really, really hard. And I think it is for most people, because you try and tie it up alongside everyone else and you can't. You try and do it yourself just for you, and you can't, and people don't let you. It's quite, in all good nature, they sometimes create a difficult path.
You've said in your statement that a lot of the medication for Parkinson's is old.
It's 60 years old. It's outrageous. It should not be 60 years old.
And there's not a very... it can be difficult to find the right medication that then doesn't affect your liver.
That's also true, but then when you found it, you almost immediately it feels as if you've got to find something else, because it's working all the time, and mostly in a negative direction.
And so with somebody who doesn't have the liver difficulties, with the Parkinson's disease, they might change the medication very regularly. And
yes, and it might be quite a good thing to do, but if you're very allergic, because I'm really allergic to medicines, you have to decide what you're going to do without.
And I think you've said in your statement that the doctors have struggled with that, finding the combination that works that also doesn't impact on your liver condition.
Well, it almost always does now, but it's a slightly different weight in the summation of it.
And trying to balance
yes.
the liver function versus the Parkinson's.
Yes, and you know that you're a loser right from the start until there's another situation in which people can find their way to a positive research setup.
This morning, with the panel, we talked about the connection between ill health and the hepatitis B. For you, how much discussion has there been with your clinicians throughout these bouts of physical ill health about any connection with the hepatitis B?
It's been a constant similar nightmare, really, and I don't normally talk in those ways, but I would say it's so put a brake on what you do, and even what you think, and what other people think, and what your family thinks, and what your children think, and how far should you go with this person not to be deprived of dentistry, or how much do you go this far not to be deprived of tests that you think are more relevant than they do. But you can go on forever, which is the most extraordinary thing about this, because it's so wrapped in tiny things that don't work.
How many discussions have you had, or how often have you talked with clinicians about whether there's a connection between what you faced and the hepatitis B?
There clearly isn't an answer to that in whole. But I found it extremely difficult to worry more than to take the pills. Other people do it the other way.
And what's the impact of the infection been on your mental well-being?
Well, it's again, puts you into a high risk area of thought and care and love and everything, and you really cannot serve yourself up any better than you do, but it doesn't feel like that. And I have to worry about how much of that was me.
Earlier, the panel talked about feeling like they were a leper, that they were
Yes,
infectious. Is that something that you have any reflections on?
yes, indeed, because you can't describe it. If there's no words, it's very difficult to get people to be interested. And you have to make decisions about whether you actually see your friends and say, sorry, I can't do that today. Had a really bad test for liver. But a lot of people of my age, backwards as opposed to forwards, would never talk about it on the basis that, schools and social lives and other health issues would be a problem to them. And there was no information just around that you could pick up and use to build your own sense of what was going on.
So you were lacking information about the hepatitis B, and it wasn't discussed within your peer group or your friends?
It wasn't my peer group or even in hospital. I had no idea I'd had anything, in inverted commas, but presumably they must have had some indication that I'd had something. And whether that kept them quiet or whether they didn't get the right answers, how would I ever know? I do know that we were lucky to keep the children.
Another discussion we had this morning was about difficulties with insurance and life insurance and travel insurance. Was that something that you faced with the hepatitis B?
I did, but nobody was quite as into it as they are now. And so it really was up to you at what level you would put yourself in and feel that you had some kind of integrity. But it was very much a single situation determined by you, and then assessed as being possibly a bit dodgy if you weren't really careful about the detail. But that in itself leads to a moment when you know you've got to go in and say to your dentist, I'm awfully sorry, but I'm carrying something that might kill you and you might need to know. And not many people have actually put forward the strength of the possibility of not being here for ages. And I find that really odd.
From a financial perspective, obviously with hepatitis B, you're not eligible for the financial assistance schemes that we've talked about in the inquiry that there is available for the HIV and hepatitis C sufferers, or for some of them. That ineligibility, how has that made you feel? Have you been aware of the schemes and not being able to apply for them?
Yes, but I think I'd come to terms with sorting my own structure out so that I didn't have to worry every time anything came round, and I'd actually done what I needed. And actually, in those days it was easier. Never quite sure why it was. Just maybe it was that you were still running mostly around. Now I find it quite difficult.
Because at that point you were still able to work within the civil service, albeit that you retired perhaps earlier than you would have done.
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
No, that's okay. You said that you'd managed to arrange your own affairs in terms of financial affairs early on in the time. And is that because you were able to keep working
Yes.
for quite a long time in the civil service?
Well, I did work for a long number of years in terms of the amount of work, but I didn't do so much work as I would have expected to do. And I was lucky because I was well treated by the civil service in terms of what I could do. And that was really appreciated because the flexibility was given.
And so perhaps because the civil service were able to support you, you worked longer than you might have done in another role.
That's definitely true, and also because of the effort made to get there. It's a question of, have I managed to roll up the hill, and is it okay to keep going for a bit longer? But it has pretty much made itself impossible now.
And you retired early from
I
the
retired
civil
early,
service.
but I kept on working for,
Yes.
I sat on ethics committees and other things that I really enjoyed, so I was very lucky.
They're the topics we talked about as a panel this morning. So, Brian, do you have anything else you would like to ask?
No, I don't, thank you.
Sally, is there anything else you would like to add before we finish?
No, I don't think so, thank you, because you've given me a chance to know much more than I would have ever known in any other way. So my senses of gratitude and keep on going.
Well, can I thank you for being in a good place today, enough to be here and keep on going, as you said. It's been important to listen to what you've had to say, so thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Miss Fraser-Butlin tomorrow.
So just give me one moment. I'm sorry, Ms Richards gave me the note. Apologies. We will be hearing from two witnesses
About Alderhay.
in relation to Alderhay. I have it here. Apologies, sir. We will be hearing from Susan Hallwood and Elaine Reid.
Yep, so 10 o'clock tomorrow.